Good morning. I'm your speaker this morning. I hope you're all still doing that in 30 minutes.
30 minutes?
Dave Weatherall couldn't be here this morning. He asked if I videotaped this, and I subsequently had about 6 or 7 other people ask, so I'm videotaping it, so be on your best behavior. Yeah. A few weeks ago, there was an article in the morning news written by David Suzuki. And in that article, he said that those who did not subscribe to his philosophy on climate change either lacked a basic education, had no common sense, or were heavily invested in the oil industry. I do have a basic education. Have been told I do have a lot of common sense, and I have no investments in the oil industry. So I'm going to give you my perspective. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to be sharing with you a lot of science around climate change. I don't expect I'm going to change anybody's mind on the subject, but at least at the end, some of you will have a minimum of an idea of why some of us do not subscribe to. Is there a problem?
I've got to straighten it, sorry.
Oh, we've got to straighten it.
Pull the table back. Pull the table back and I'll totally bring it up. Lower the leg and lower the leg.
Keep talking, Joe.
Okay, so what did you just do to my presentation? Okay, there we go. At least at the end of this, some of you will understand why myself and a few others don't subscribe to Mr. Suzuki's philosophy. A few weeks ago, we had a speaker that presented a chart that looked something like this. I believe his chart went back 400,000 years. This one goes back 1,000,000 years. I'm going to reference this later on, so I don't need you to memorize it. But I will reference this chart later. I want to kick this off by talking about what's the relationship between CO2 in the atmosphere and climate change. We all have heard about the 400 parts per million. I've got a 3-minute video I'm going to play, actually from an individual in Australia, and it kind of sets up a couple of other slides that puts that 400 parts per million in perspective. Hopefully I've got all the sound equipment working well.
Welcome. Carbon dioxide, CO2. Less than 0.04% of Earth's air. In every 85,800 molecules of air, shown here as rice grains, just 33 are carbon dioxide. Of these 33 CO2 molecules, 32 are from nature. Carbon dioxide from human activity, that's farming, transport, mining, and industry, is only 3% of Earth's annual CO2 production. 85,800 molecules of air, 32 molecules of CO2 from nature, and 1 from us. 32 essential for life, 1 supposedly causing catastrophic global warming. No, it's not. The truth is carbon dioxide is essential for all life on Earth, crops, forests, food, humans, and animals. It is resident in the atmosphere for as little as 4 or 5 years before being recycled into plants, soil, rocks, and oceans. 4 years, not 100 or even 1,000, as you're being told. But wait, it's crazy. Of this tiny amount of human-made carbon dioxide, Aussies make just 1.5%. Australian carbon dioxide is 1 molecule in every 5.7 million molecules of air. The government and the Greens have stated their tax is designed to reduce our carbon dioxide production from 1 molecule in every 5.7 million molecules of air to 1 molecule in every 6 million molecules of air. For that, they're introducing a carbon dioxide tax, designed to cost you $72 billion in the first 5 years. Measurements cited by the government themselves reveal temperature changes precede changes in carbon dioxide levels. Temperature sets carbon dioxide levels. Carbon dioxide does not determine the temperature. Variation alone in nature's carbon dioxide production is estimated at 4 times the total human production. Nature alone determines carbon dioxide levels, not humans. The sole supposed expert advisor on climate science to the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee is Professor Will Stephan. He's paid by the Department of Climate Change. He recently made public admissions. Based on his own words, it seems clear that he misled the Government Greens Committee that recommended the tax to Parliament. The carbon dioxide tax contradicts science and nature. It's based on misrepresentations, corruption, fraud, and lies. It ignores the wishes of the people, your wishes. Axe the tax.
I'm not going to talk any more about taxes, but to put this in perspective, and you could probably guess I was going to come up with something like this. To put it in a football context, I found a stadium in the United States that actually held 86,000 people. It's in Norman, Oklahoma. And my question is, can you find the 35 people in there that would represent carbon tax out of those 86,000, or carbon? And can you find the one that's going to influence the outcome of the game? 86,001. We hear a lot about the acceleration of carbon in the atmosphere, and that is one of the biggest concerns. It is growing so rapidly. So I wanted to put that in perspective as well. 120 years ago, the chart on your left, we had 300 parts per million. That's what 300 parts per million looks like. The chart on the right has 400 parts per million. Can you see the enormous difference between those two charts? 400 parts per million. For the record, scientists tell us that the optimum concentration of CO2 is 1,000 parts per million. Other scientists tell us that the concentration in our atmosphere has been as high as 2,000 parts per million, and at that time life has flourished. And I've heard a lot of other statistics that raise that number quite a bit higher, and with no consequences. We all hear about the greenhouse effect, and many scientists agree that without the greenhouse effect, our planet would be 33 degrees Celsius colder than it is right now. In other words, we would be in an ultra ice age. We all hear about, well, 97% of scientists, or 97% of scientists say that, agree that man is causing climate change. Well, first of all, and they refer to the word consensus, so there's a consensus, but actually, consensus is not a scientific term. Consensus is a political term. There is scientific theory, and we all go back to our grade 9 or grade 10 science classes. And we hear about theory, and theory is always challenged. You hear about consensus, and yet, I wish Dave Witherall were here, scientists are still debating gravity. And that's been around since Isaac Newton. Climate science has been around for 40 or 50 years, and they say it's concluded, there's no discussion. Okay, where did the 97% come from? The original statement was the Earth is warming and human emission of greenhouse gases are the main cause. The main cause meaning over 50% of greenhouse gases or man-made climate change is caused by man. Politicians subsequently changed that statement to include the words dangerous or catastrophic. I think the original 97% came from a speech from Barack Obama. That number is not 97%. It's actually 0.3%. It was traced back, the 97% was traced back to a man named John Cook. John Cook is a research assistant professor of communications at George Mason University. He and his colleagues reviewed 11,994 abstracts, and they concluded that 97% of scientists agreed that man was causing climate change. The Wall Street Journal, amongst other organizations, went back and did the research and reviewed that research done by Mr. Cook and his colleagues. And what they found that 7,930 of those papers had to be excluded because they made no opinion whatsoever about man and climate change. 3,896 were marked as agreeing that humans cause some climate change, but they didn't agree to the 50% or more. 64 papers of the 11,994 were marked as endorsing the statement as defined, over 50%. But actually only 41 of those papers actually endorsed that statement, 0.3%. 0 papers endorsed man-made catastrophe. The presentation of these statistics were made by Lord Christopher Monckton, who was a former science advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Also, after that 97% came out, several of the scientists who were cited as agreeing or being part of the 97% protested to Cook and said that they were misrepresented. Take a few minutes and look at some of those headlines. Do any of those headlines look familiar to anybody in the room? Well, if you're nodding your head, you're lying, because there's only one person in the room that might recognize them, and that's Dr. John, because they came from 1934. Which was before CO2 emissions began. We're led to believe that climate change is causing more intense storms, tornadoes, hurricanes. The weather is changing, and it's threatening life on the planet because it's becoming more intense and more horrific. And yet, if you spend just a few minutes on Google and look it up, you'll find the most powerful hurricanes in the last 120 years, 1935, 1980, 1988. Seasons with more than one Category 5 storm, 1932, 1933, 1961, 2005, which was Katrina, 2007, and 2017. Seasons with more than 2 Category 5 storms, 1, 2005, when Katrina came through. At that time, we were told that was going to be the norm, that from here on out, we were going to be seeing Katrinas every year. Excuse me, every year. And we should get ready to expect that. That was 14 years ago, and nothing has happened since. This was a chart put out by a Dr. Maue, I think, M-A-U-E, who did a study of the intensity of storms. And what you can see from this is the intensity of storms peaked between 1990 and 2000. And then other than Katrina, the intensity of storms has dropped off considerably. In his statement, he said, in the 12 years since 2006, Northern Hemisphere and global tropical cyclone energy has decreased dramatically to the lowest levels since the late 1970s. Additionally, the frequency of tropical cyclones has reached a historical low. Ryan Mao, his studies were peer-reviewed and verified. And that's actually the chart that he produced from his studies. And as you can see, the peaks, particularly 90 to 2000, and how it's dropped off since then. I think this has come up in one of our questions before, but what was the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history? Does anybody know? It wasn't Katrina.
Early 1900s.
Early 1900s. Actually, it was 1900. Galveston hurricane killed at least 6,000 people. There are numbers as high as 12,000 in that 1900 hurricane. The other thing about the consensus and the 97% and all the charts that are being drawn is that there are no straight lines in nature. Nothing goes straight up. Everything in nature is either spinning spheres or waves. Refer back to that first chart I showed you. Increases over 1 million years, increase in temperature, decrease in temperature, increase in temperature, decrease in temperature. It goes in a wave. About 100 years ago, Dr. Raymond Wheeler and 200 researchers reviewed some of the Greenland ice cores, and they mapped back temperatures going back a few thousand years. What they found in the trends is that there were major climate cycles every 100, 170, 515, and 1,030 years. To map this over history, it's interesting to note that the major civilization peaks during most of those warming periods, and how civilization decreased in the times in between. Looking at it another way, this charts out the length of those warming periods and the intensity of those warming periods. There was another chart which I didn't include that draws a line from the ancient Egypt forward and actually shows that the temperatures back then were a lot warmer than they are now. Ancient Egypt. That probably explains why they recently found a SUV buried under one of the pyramids. Inject a little bit of humor into this. But what those charts and what the study of Dr. Berry also revealed is that after every warming period, there's a cooling period. Several scientists have now told us that we are beginning to enter a cooling period. You've all seen the projection models. In 1988, James Hansen presented to the US Senate. He had been studying temperatures going back from 1960 to 1988, and based on the temperature trends, he developed a computer model that predicted where temperatures were going to be going in the next 20, 30, 40 years. It's hard to see, but this model here, he presented two different scenarios. The top line is scenario A. The line below that is scenario B. The line below that is what actually happened to temperatures. Now, Dr. Hansen wasn't the only one to come up with a model. In fact, this model takes a look at the summarization of 102 different models. Now, it's important to note, too, that every one of these models projecting temperatures have an inherent bias built into them of the person programming the model. The dark line in the middle takes the average of all the models, 102 models, and what they projected temperatures were going to be. That line down there at the bottom is what temperatures actually did during that same time frame. Environmental impact. Not subscribing to man-made catastrophe theory does not mean that people aren't concerned about the environment. If you are concerned about the environment and human life, the question is, should you be concerned about something like windmills? How many in here feel that the energy generated by windmills is clean energy? No, oh, one hand going up. Well, if you love toxic waste, then windmills are clean energy. Many of you don't know that windmills contain approximately 8,000 parts, mostly steel and a lot of concrete. Concrete's one of the top 5 things that generates a lot of CO2. The key components of those windmills are magnets and then the blades. They require use of rare earth minerals, which are only available from China. The process of producing these magnets and the blades produces large amounts of toxic waste. That's the name or the place in China where those manufacturing plants are. I can't pronounce that name, Bateau or Batu. But the inhabitants of that area around where those manufacturing plants are and where the lake is where they dump the toxic waste were quoted as saying, anything we planted just withered, then our animals started to sicken and die. People, too, began to suffer. Dalhousie villagers say their teeth began to fall out, their hair turned white at an unusually young age, and they suffered from severe skin and respiratory diseases. Well, you're probably saying, well, how much of that rare earth is in a windmill, Keith? A 2 megawatt wind turbine requires at least 752 pounds of rare earth minerals. That comes from an MIT study. Mining 1 ton of rare earth minerals generates 1 ton of radioactive waste. In 2012, the U.S. added 13,131 megawatts of wind generating capacity, which means somewhere between 4.9 million and 6.1 million pounds of radioactive waste was generated. To put that in perspective, the American nuclear industry produced between 4.4 and 5 million pounds of nuclear waste each year. Nuclear industry produced 1/5 of the energy in 2012 compared to 3.5% by wind. Growth of the wind industry could increase demand for one of those rare earths by 700% over the next 25 years. The demand for the other rare earth mineral would increase by 2,600%. So basically, every turbine erected contributes to a vast man-made lake of poison in northern China. Talk about Germany for a minute. Germany's leading the world in renewable energy. They're the world leader in solar. They're number 3 in the world in wind power. And in any given week, these sources of energy will produce 5% of Germany's power. Now, people will say, and rightly so, that on a given day, it can produce 50%. But during the winter, it's 0. No sun, and if there's no wind, it's 0. Alex Epstein wrote a book a few years ago called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. In his book, he pulled together a number of charts charting CO2 emissions compared to population growth, life expectancy, and GDP per person, and found a very interesting correlation between those 4 factors. 1968, the population of the world was 3.6 billion. Today, we have twice as many people, and they are better off, healthier, better nourished, more successful than they were in 1968. A modern combine harvester driven by a single human can reap enough wheat in a single day to make 1/2 million loaves of bread. Basically, scientists say we would not have an agriculture industry if it weren't for fossil fuels. One of the members of the club, who will remain unnamed, provided me with this chart. So what are the effects of climate change? And I know a lot of you are saying, but Keith, July 2019 was the hottest July on record. Well, actually, if you look it up, it was the 4th hottest on record. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few months that's ratcheted back down again. In 2015, NASA came out and said that 2014 was the hottest year on record. A few months later, they came back and said, well, we actually misspoke. There's a 38% chance that it was the hottest year on record. So their numbers weren't 100% accurate initially. But the interesting thing is, we all talk about July and how hot it was, but 2019 was one of the coldest Februaries in the last 125 years. It's described as below to much below average. January 30th, 2019 was the coldest day in Chicago in the last 34 years. Rockford, Illinois broke their all-time record cold temperature on January 31st, 2019. July in Europe, mass hysteria. Everybody said that's absolute proof that the Earth's warming. It's actually the purple areas there where the temperature went above 40 degrees for a day or two. If you can see, if you look at the whole map of Europe, there are several areas where the temperature was 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. And then as you got closer to Paris, France, it warmed up. I was curious as to how that temperature in Paris, France compared to some of the hottest days ever in Canada. Because we were told a few weeks ago that Canada and Russia and the Northern Hemisphere was experiencing much more rapid increase in temperatures than any place else in the world. 42.6 degrees in Paris. Yellowgrass, Saskatchewan, July 1937, it reached 45. Bassano Dam, Alberta, July 1931, 43.3. St. Albans, Manitoba, July 1936, 44.4. So I dug a little bit further and I said, what are the highest temperatures ever in Canada? And I'd be curious if anybody knew how many of the highest temperatures ever, the 42 highest temperatures ever in Canada, have occurred since the year 2000. Zero. Yep, you're right, 0. How many have occurred since the year 1980? 0 again. How many of the hottest temperatures in Canada have occurred since 1960? 1. You've got to go back to the 30s and 40s to get the hottest temperatures ever in Canada. The hottest temperature ever in the world was in 1913 in Death Valley in the States. 1913. Getting close to the end, folks. Less than 2 months ago, 2 scientists from a university in Stockholm, or in Finland actually, produced a paper summarizing their research into climate change. What they concluded is that human activity accounted for 0.01 degrees Celsius in global temperature in the last 100 years. They also said all human activity has virtually no measurable impact on the temperature of the planet. Apparently, the IPCC analysis of global temperature suffered from one glaring error. They failed to account for the influences of low cloud cover. Interesting enough, in June 2019, researchers in Kobe University in Japan published a paper that came to the exact same conclusions. They basically said, go out and use all the fossil fuels you want. There's absolutely no impact on climate. This is a petition a lot of people aren't aware of because you don't hear about it in the news. I don't expect you can read it, so I'm going to read you the last paragraph of this petition. This petition was signed by 31,487 American scientists. 9,029 of them were PhDs. The second paragraph of that petition reads, there is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. Moreover, there is a substantial scientific evidence that increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide produce many beneficial effects upon the natural plant, animal, and environments of the Earth. 31,487 scientists. Our last speaker from a few weeks ago, in his concluding remarks, said that all you have to do is look to the insurance industry. The insurance industry really buys into the man-made climate change. And my reaction to that was, right, if I were an insurance salesman, would I want the government to say there's going to be more floods, more fires, more catastrophes that could damage my property? I'd love that. Yeah. Boy, that's going to put money in my pocket. Keep pumping up that catastrophe. The science is not settled. Dr. Judith Curry, who go out and take a look at her. She was the head of climatology at a major university in Georgia and resigned because she was being forced to say things which were against her beliefs and all the scientific evidence she had. And she says science is never settled. There's a whole lot more that we don't know than what we do know. Like I said earlier, we're talking about a science that's 40 to 50 years old. One last slide. I think I made it in time. I often feel like, trying to talk to the governments of the world about climate change it reminds me of the movie The Wizard of Oz and Dorothy trying to talk to the wizard. And I'm not sure if you remember this scene. I'll take a few questions.
So Keith, there's some rumors about the actual cost of what I call the myth, climate change myth. There is a cost linked to this, and somebody's getting paid big time. I've heard it's as high as $1 trillion.
Yeah, I saw one study, one report that the climate change industry is a $1 trillion industry. And if you think about it, between solar power, windmills, carbon tax, electric cars, you can get to $1 trillion pretty quickly. And that there's an inherent interest in preserving that $1 trillion industry, which is why there is so much pushback against anybody that disagrees with man-made climate change. Stewie?
I was going to ask about the speaker that you had. I presume it's the same speaker that we had at our club, and he was recommending that Vernon hire all of these engineers and climatologists and whatnot to study what Vernon is going to do in the event of catastrophic climate change. What's your comment on that? It seems to me that if there's a flood, we all go out and build sandbags. I don't know exactly what a...
Yeah, you know, several people say rather than trying to do whatever we can to come up with alternative forms of energy, I mean, yeah, that's probably a good plan, although it's not reliable and not efficient, but that we should be focusing on what do we do to help. We've been having hurricanes and tornadoes since the dawn of time. The climate has been changing for 4.5 billion years. And we need to be helping people deal with that. We need to be doing things like Rotary does. And when there is a hurricane, getting supplies to that area of the world that's suffered. Helping people deal with climate change that's happened for 4.5 billion years and is not going to go away. So yeah, we ought to be dealing with things like there inevitably will be floods, there inevitably will be fires. We've been lucky we haven't had any too close to us. So we should be helping those rather than trying to bankrupt a country with things like carbon tax.
I was going to add that early warning systems.
Early warning systems.
Work on the science for early warning systems and better warning systems for earthquakes. My brother lived in Chile. He said if there wasn't some kind of tremor each day, he was worried that was racking up to be a bigger earthquake, 3 days down the road. And so those early warning detection systems and getting those people to safety before it hit. Because, do you believe in climate change? I personally, yeah, I do. Do I think it's man-made? No, I think it's just the evolution of time over billions and billions of years. It's just a big cycle, and we're just in a different cycle now.
One other thing, Keith, I just wanted to mention, I didn't want to mention this before, but interestingly enough, there's been a huge movement where these people are actually starting to question some of the information. Some of the scientific information is highly questionable. And just so you know, not that I want to tell you about this now, but on Monday, Elections Canada has deemed it a partisan issue. It's now, they've deemed it political.
Bob, one more question and then we've got to get on with business.
I have two questions. The first one, your research on solar energy, does that create a lot of toxic material to build solar panels and that? And the second question is, in your research on climate, the fact of the reduction in the Arctic ice, and that's a given. We see that, and it's right in front of us. And the creation of permafrost thawing and the release of carbon dioxide into the air. Has there been any projections as to what's going to happen with the climate because of those changes? So solar panel and then...
First of all, I have not looked into the issue of solar panels to know, what ingredients are in there. So I can't answer that one. I do know that, looking at statistics to develop the number of solar panels that they feel is required to replace fossil fuels, you'd have to practically cover the earth with solar panels. And the second question was permafrost.
The Arctic ice reduction.
Actually, a number of things I read recently and I've read this several times over the last couple of years, ice in the Antarctic is increasing, okay? I read a report, yes, it is increasing, it's getting thicker, and that's been well documented, and it's been well documented several times over the last few years. There was a time, one time, and I can't remember which year it was in the last 5 years, where the videos from space showed that the ice in the Arctic had increased from the year before. So it's not consistently decreasing. And I read a recent report that said there were parts of Greenland that are increasing in ice, and there are other parts of Greenland that are decreasing in ice.
Keith, I can confirm, I was in a session with Dr. Patrick Moore in May, and he indicated that the same thing that you've just said, and he's a climate scientist. But he also indicated that there are strong indications that we're actually moving into an ice age.
Yep. Okay. I'll be glad, Dr. John.
Pete, I'd just like to